Hello, those of you who are here and future people who are watching this on YouTube. Basically, today we are going to do our best to continue talking about what we started last class, which was in the class before, talking about dual process theory. But first, a note on the papers. If you have turned in your paper at this point, that means I have it and I will start grading them, or I've started grading them. But it's going to take me about a week or so to get them all done. They're going to go basically in the order with which I received them. That just seems fair. So when you get them back, there will be bunches of comments on them. Those are there for you to learn from and use on a future occasion to improve your papers. But I don't offer rewrites, in case you had forgotten that. So basically what the grade you see is the grade you'll get. And if you haven't gotten it into me yet and don't have an extension, get it to me ASAP. If you do have an extension, get it into me as soon as your extension's up. So that's the background. And again, it's going to take me about a week or so to get them back to you. So if you're wondering why don't I have my paper, it's because I'm trying to give good feedback, which takes a while. All right. So that's the paper business stuff. The next thing I want to do is just kind of talk about where we came from, how this all fits together, and how what we're talking about today fits in with what we talked about last class. So basically, you'll remember from last class and the class before, we've been talking about this idea that the mind is almost like a computer. It runs a language of thought, and this is supposed to follow the rules of logic. So the reason why our thinking seems to be logical is that the rules of logic are cooked into our brain. They're part of the way our mind works. So this is kind of the background, the Fodorian view about the computational theory of mind. And then the idea was supposed to be that some opponents to this come along. So they say, wait a second, if we're so rational, if we're so logical, if it's cooked into our brain, if it's part of how we're designed, then why do we make so many logical mistakes and do many things which are irrational or illogical? And so these were the questions that I had you ask a few classes ago. If you describe someone and ask them what's more likely, that they are a New Yorker or a person from the New Yorker from the Bronx, even if all the descriptions you give, Yankees fan, et cetera, are more similar to your prototype or your idea of what a person from the Bronx looks like more than a general New Yorker. The idea is that you should still guess that somebody's from New York generally, because that's the way that statistics work. However, we make lots of mistakes like this. Again, the other example we had was what's more likely if somebody believes in law and order, et cetera, that they're a cop or that they're a cop voting for Trump. A lot of people say cop voting for Trump, but the correct answer would be cop, just because it's a larger group. So those were what we talked about. So that was the background. So the idea was, well, if that's the case, then if we make these mistakes, how is that possible if our mind is logical? And we said that there are three options at this point. Option one, you just hold on and say that, no. We make these mistakes for some other reason. Fodor's right. Our mind is all propositional, language of thought, logic-based. It's just that when we make mistakes like this, there's something else going on. The other extreme approach, so we have it is still all lot. The other approach is language of thought is wrong. And then there was this middle ground approach. And the middle ground approach was the dual process or dual system. And so the idea was that in the middle, you say, all right, Fodor's right about certain types of logical reasoning, but the reason we make mistakes along the lines of we're tempted to say someone's more likely to be a cop who's going to vote for Trump than a cop in general is because there's this other system that runs in the background, this automatic, low attention, low energy requiring system, and that's responsible for it. So last time we looked at what dual process theory was, how it compares to the language of thought sort of theory, and considered, excuse me, and considered some of the evidence and some of the things people say for it. What I want to do this class is talk about a response to that. And so this class, we're basically going to be talking about the people who say it is all language of thought. And the reasons that we make these mistakes have got to be something else. There is some other reason that we are not perfect logical reasoners. It's not that our brains are not designed in the way that Fodor says. It's just there's something else going on. Now, we're not going to talk about what else is going on. Instead, we're just going to be talking about basically an attack on the dual process theory. And in particular, so just to draw up how this works. Also, if you're wondering why I'm going to be lecturing a bit more today instead of like trying to make it a bit more back and forth, is because as I said at the start, like 25 to 75% of my mind is on kind of like elsewhere, and I'm trying my best to rein it in, but it's hard to think of good questions to ask when my mind is, busy on other things that I can't control. So if at any point I'm saying something and you want to jump in, please interrupt me, shout, type in the chat. But that's why I'm a little more just kind of lectury, because again, I'm just kind of woo. All right, where was I? All right, so with a dual process, let's just compare. We've got this dual process theory and the idea of it's all propositional. So these two views share a lot in common. So the dual process theory and the propositional theory agree that a lot of thinking happens in a propositional manner. They both agree that when I'm having a train of thought, like planning where I'm going to go after this, they both agree that it's a matter of logical thinking, logical step by step. What they disagree on are cases in which it's supposed to be simpler or automatic. And so the way that you would argue against the dual process theory, if you believe it's all propositional, is you just attack those simple sort of things, the associative links, which are supposed to explain why we behave irrationally in many cases. So what we're going to be looking at, therefore, in this class, and what the article for this week looked at, was one of the things that's in here, the things that the other system is supposed to explain, the not propositional one. So what we're going to look at in particular is, where's my black marker? Associative learning. And so basically the way to think about the article that you read this week, the Mitchell, etc., is that they are deciding to attack dual process theory by looking at one of the things that is supposed to be explained by the other system, the system one, the intuitive, automatic, fast, unconscious system. And so they're going to look at one of the many things which dual process theorists say are controlled by this process one or system one. And they're going to argue that this thing, which is taken to be a very common instance of this other system, is actually better understood in a propositional logical sort of way. So instead of thinking that this classical case of conditioning, or this case in which many people say, oh, this is an instance of clear instance of associationism or of this other dumb system one. Well, Mitchell and DeHauer and I can't remember the third author, Lovabond, all are going to say that no, even this case is an instance of propositional learning. So that's the background here. Does this make sense to some degree? Again, all right. So let me talk then about the background. What do we mean by associative learning? So, what do we mean by learning, first off? What is it to learn something? And this is a very simple question. We all know it in our everyday lives, but what does it mean in a psychological context or psychology context? Anyone have any thoughts? And this is not an easy thing. You have to understand, and it's not just to understand it, it's to gain in understanding. So when you learn something, you rather are gaining information that you didn't have at the beginning. So it's not just that it's stored away in your brain. It's rather that you come to gain more information than you had before. So one of the types of learning that can happen in a human being is you learn that two things go together. So for instance, in the course of your life, yeah, forming concepts, Kaywin, is another one. These are things in which learning is, one of the things you can do is learn new concepts. But another simpler sort of learning is to learn relationships between the concepts, or you learn how things relate to each other. So for instance, at some point in your life, you learned that if you punch a wall, it's gonna hurt. So on the one hand, you've got the punch, and on the other, you've got the hurt. And originally, you may not have known that punching a wall hurt, probably as a baby, until you started falling. You didn't realize that these things were connected. And it was only over time that you learned they went together. So this is what associative learning is. You learn that two things are associated together. Now, this is the tough part, which the authors talk about, is associative learning is also used in a secondary way. And so this is kind of confusing. Now, everyone agrees that associative learning is a thing in which you learn that two things go together. The question is, how does this happen? What is involved in learning this sort of association? And there's two different views on this. And this is ultimately what comes down to the dual process versus the propositional theory. According to a propositional theorist, what it is to learn associatively is to gain a belief that two things go together. So it's to believe, and you form a belief, and in your belief box goes something like punching things will hurt my hand. So this is an entire thing that you stand in a relationship to. And this is the language of thought sort of idea. So to gain associative learning is to gain this belief. On the flip side, there's this view that what it is to learn, what it is to associatively learn is for you to have a belief, like a punching belief. So let's say punch. And you have or not a belief, you have a concept of punch, a representation of the act of punching. And then you have another representation, say pain. And what it is to associative learn is just for a link to form between these two things. And specifically a link that runs in this direction. So that's this type of the confusing thing comes in which sometimes people refer to this mechanism as association or a forming of an association. William, is that a hand?
Yeah. So like, would these both be parts of like a RTM?
So yes, so we are in 100%. Both associationist views and propositional only views. These are all under the umbrella of representational theory of mind, because both of them are going to believe that we have symbols in our head that represent other symbols. It's now within that discipline, we have arguments about how the representing works, and specifically in this case, how learning works. So on the one side, people are going to say that to learn that punching something will lead to pain in my hand is to have a link form between these two representations. It's just almost a mechanical process. On the other side, it's a formation of a belief. So the way to think of this is that this sort of view over here, the dual process theory believes that this is a thing that can happen. They think that there can be these sorts of pure links. So dual process is going to believe in this one. Well, over here, a propositional only view or a logic only or a language of thought only view is going to hold that this is the only type there is. Now, the dual process is going to say in other cases outside associative learning, there are going to be sorts of reasoning like this. But in this particular case, when we're interested in associative learning, it's this pure mechanical sort of process. So that's the idea here. And the classic case of associative learning is the one that I mentioned last time of Pavlov and his dogs. So the idea would be that so as a reminder, the way the experiment worked was Pavlov brought some dogs into a lab. he would start by ringing a bell and then giving them food, ringing a bell, giving them food. And over time, what happened was usually if you give a dog food, it salivates. Over time, as the bell would ring and the food was given, the bell would ring, food was given, salivation. Bell, food, salivation. Over time, though, this link formed such that when the bell would be rung, even if no food was given, the dogs would start drooling. So this is what's called the, to use some terminology from Pavlov that's going to come up again in a second. Okay, there we go. We've got the food. I'm going to draw, pretend that's dog food. This is what's called the unconditioned stimulus. And the unconditioned stimulus, regardless of anything else, will cause the response, namely drooling. That's a drool. Drool, here, we can draw some multiple drool drops. However, what Pavlov did is he added the bell in, and this is going to be a problem because I don't know how to draw a bell that doesn't look like a drool drop. There we go. So what happens is this bell would ring, ding-a-ling-ling, and this is called the conditioned stimulus, the CS. So the way the conditioned stimulus works is this is the thing which comes to be associated with the response. So over time, what happens is the conditioned stimulus alone will cause the response. Originally, though, it was just the unconditioned stimulus, but by pairing these two together, it will over time cause the response. So the way that this gets explained on a dual process theory is over time you have an image of a bell, you have a representation of a bell, and this comes to be linked with the salivation. This just gets linked to the drool drop. So it looks something like this if you were to represent what's going on in the mind. Bell gets linked to drool drop. According to the propositional theory of how associative learning works, what comes to happen is you form a belief, something along the fact of a ringing bell signals food. And so the signaling of food causes the drooling. Or I guess, this would be more accurate. It's that this gets linked to food and then the food causes the drool. So this is the basic fundamental difference between the two. So the question at this point is, why are we talking about learning? We've talked about this dual process view overall as a big picture sort of view about how the mind works. So the question is, why is it that DeHauer and Mitchell and Lovabond talk about learning or focus on associative learning in this case? Why is it that they're not talking about it? So propositional only theory, the dog learned the food is always coming after the ring. Yes, the dog, so the way that the propositional theory in the dog case is going to attribute to the dog some sort of dog propositional belief. Like one of the things is that the dog is literally forming a dog belief that the bell signals food. So if you go with the propositional only view, you're giving a lot of credit to the dog in this case. You're not saying it's a purely mechanical association. You're instead saying that the dog is forming a belief. Maybe dogs don't form beliefs as complex as humans do, but you are saying that you are committing yourself to the view that dogs have a language of thought of some sort and that they reason in it and that they follow low level, at least some logical processes. So that's the background here. Why are we talking about learning? And there's two main reasons for this. The first one is this is the most classical case of what an associative mechanism is. So the idea is that because whenever people talk about, sorry, I shouldn't have said associative mechanism here, the linking sort of way of thinking, the automatic processing that a dual process theorist sees, they think the paradigm case or the clearest example of this is associative learning. This is the one that all the other ones are modeled off. So if you can show that this case can be explained in a proposition only sort of way, you're kind of saying, Well, I can show the most extreme case. So if I can show this one, all the other ones will be easier to show. It's almost like, what's the quickest way? Imagine a case in which you walk into somewhere you're not supposed to be, and there's a whole bunch of people around, and you need to prove that it's okay that you're there. There's a bunch of big, tough guys standing there. What's the quickest way to make sure that you don't get bothered while you're there? Which guy should you punch, basically? If you walk into a room and you see like a few people of all different sizes, and you're trying to prove like, don't screw with me, who should you punch in the mouth first?
The biggest guy.
Yeah, the biggest guy. So in the same way, this sort of thought, because if you can punch the biggest guy and get away with it, then none of the little guys are going to mess with you. So in the same way, if you can prove that associative learning is not associative, then the rest of the things that dual process theory says are associative are going to fall out of the way as well. So the second reason, though, is that associative learning is something with like a lot of practical implications. So if associative learning, this process in which we learn that one thing goes with another thing, if we can learn that, if we understand how that works, it's going to have a lot of practical implications for questions in the real world. So let's just take an actual example, and there's been a lot of work done on this, really interesting work on implicit bias. What is implicit bias? Anyone know? How many people are familiar with this terminology? So first off, what is bias? What is it to be biased?
To be predisposed to like make a decision.
Yeah, it's to have a predisposition towards a certain group, and it's usually, or towards a certain outcome, a certain something. And it's usually either a positive or a negative view. So before you go into it, you've already kind of found yourself leaning in a certain direction. So very often people are biased towards other groups. So for instance, a member of the KKK is going to be very negatively biased towards people of color and very positively biased towards white people. So if that's bias, what is implicit bias then? What would the other option is? What's the opposite of implicit? Anyone know?
Explicit.
Yeah, explicit. The opposite of implicit is explicit. So implicit bias versus explicit bias. Well, what is the difference between something being implicit and something being explicit? Well, explicit means it's out there on the surface clearly. Implicit means it's hidden or unconscious. So unconscious is implicit. Explicit is you know it's there. So an explicit bias is a case in which somebody will blatantly say out loud, I don't like people of that group, or people of that group are worse than people of my group. So an explicit racist would be someone who says something to the effects of white people are better than black people. That would be someone who's explicitly biased. What would implicit bias be? Any guesses?
Would it be like someone who's been super conditioned, like staying with the topic of race, or maybe I should go away from it? I don't know.
No, right. This is the perfect one to stay on.
Okay, maybe if someone's been conditioned through like media throughout their entire life that people who have white features are more beautiful than people who have black features.
Yeah,
that would be implicit bias. So even like if you're comparing two people, one who has white features, one who has black features, you might say white features, well, you don't even know if you've been influenced through like years of media.
Yeah. So that's the idea here, is it's that, and Stephanie says along the same line, it's to have the same belief or behave in the same ways or along similar lines, but not be aware of it. So for instance, if you ask somebody, the way this would come apart is someone who's explicitly biased will, if you ask them who's prettier or who has more internal worth, a white person or a black person, the explicitly biased person will say, oh, it's definitely the white person. They have more worth. If you ask an implicitly biased person, though, they will do things like say, oh, they're equally valuable. They're equally the same. These two groups are identical. But then if you watch their behaviors, they only surround themselves with white people. If you ask them to, you just give them a bunch of pictures of people of various races and you ask them who's the most attractive, or give a scale of 1 to 10 for who's the most attractive. Over time, they might not realize they're doing it, but if you look at their numbers at the end, they consistently give higher values to the white people. Or if they're a CEO and you see them hiring and they consistently overlook black candidates and go for white candidates, that's another case of implicit bias. And so say that again.
Question?
Yeah.
Is there a difference between like choosing to ignore your bias and having an implicit bias?
So so I think that's a really good question, because what it comes down to, and this is why I'm bringing up implicit bias in the context of associative learning, is you could explain one way to like understand implicit bias is to say that you've learned an association, say between white and good and between black and bad. So this is one way to say what you've learned with explicit and implicit, or what it is to have a bias is to have learned this association. And the reason that I'm bringing this up in this context is one of the questions that comes up is, well, depending on how you understand unconscious processing and unconscious reasoning, it's going to determine how you think of these two things. So if you think that implicit bias is an example of associative learning, and all associative learning is the sort of thing that is just mechanical connections, then the definition is going to be that you can't really, this sort of learning that white equals good is not something that you can actually have beliefs about. It's not a belief. It's a mechanical thing programmed into your head by conditioning. It's a matter of you have a representation of whiteness and a representation of goodness, and they're just linked together over time. If, however, you believe the propositional only view, then what you're going to say is, no. What you actually do is you have a belief somewhere in your brain that white people are better than black people. And maybe you have another belief, an external one, that you respond to out loud of, no, they're exactly the same. But the way you explain this difference in behavior is you do it in terms of your relationship to a belief or what beliefs you have. While a dual process view is going to say that an explicit bias is a product of your propositional thoughts, well, implicit bias is a product of this associative mechanism, this automatic mechanism. So if you want to say that what's actually happening here is you've got this belief that you don't have an awareness of, well, if you're calling it a belief, then you have to go with the propositional only view. Well, if you think that it's rather a mechanical operation, you're going to be a dual process theorist. Now, why is it, was that responsive at all to your question, Kabir?
It probably was. I didn't understand it 100%.
Okay. Ask your question again. Let's see if I can answer it better, because it's a really good question.
Is there a difference between someone choosing to ignore their explicit bias when making a decision or someone who has an implicit bias?
So here's one thing you can say, is the answer to your question there is going to depend on whether you think implicit bias is a propositional belief at an unconscious level, or whether you think it is rather just the outcome of a mechanical association. So if you think that what it is a propositional sort of thing, and you have an unconscious or an under the surface belief that people of a certain race are better, and you act on that, then for you, there's not really going to be any difference. The thing you're ignoring, in that case is your belief that somebody's worse off. So that is something which you can bring to consciousness. You can form a view on. Like, you could have this implicit belief and say, no, I'm pushing that to the side. But if you're saying that implicit bias is the result of just this mechanical process, it's not something that you could even bring to your mind. It's not something which you can even become aware of, because it's just programmed into you. So for that person, there's going to be a major difference between a belief about certain groups of people that you can push to the side and the operation of implicit bias, because implicit bias is going to be a different process than explicit bias. So that's the background. And the reason that this is practical or has practical importance is because of what we're going to talk about next, which is we don't want people to be biased of any sort generally. You don't want people to be implicitly biased. You don't want people to be explicitly biased. And so the reason this comes up is because how you would go about reducing implicit bias is going to change depending on what type of view you have. If you think it's a mechanical process that's got nothing to do with beliefs, the only way to get rid of implicit bias is to run a mechanical process that undoes the original mechanical process. So if you think it's just association between two things, then what that means is you're going to have to get rid of that association somehow. You have to erase it. That's the only way to get rid of implicit bias. However, if you think it's a propositional approach, if you think that to be implicitly biased is to have the belief that people of other races are worse than people of your race, then you should be able to reason with this person to get them to bring that belief to a conscious level and then reason with it. So that's why this isn't just, associative learning isn't just an interesting question about how the mind works. It's also got practical implications for how you would get rid of these implicit biases, or in other cases, how you would get rid of these unconscious associations that you've formed.
Is this propositional versus mechanical thing kind of like prompt to one of the essays, like the eliminative materialism versus folk psychology?
So this is a very good question, but to answer that question, a better way of thinking of it is, so the short answer is no, it's not quite the same, but yes, they're related in terms of the mechanical versus, there's a sense in which they're related because an eliminative materialist says it's all mechanical and it's all physically mechanical. The way that dual process theory in this case is not that it's physically mechanical, it's rather that it's more metaphorically associated. So what's the best way of putting this? It's, yeah, William.
Because eliminative materialists don't believe in beliefs or desires, and the dual process theory does, because you have to believe in two beliefs or not beliefs, but like ideas, right? And you have to believe that those ideas are real and that sort of thing.
So let me actually, this is a great thing. Let me write this up here. Let's draw how this works. So we've got, you can think of the relationship between eliminative materialism and representational theory of mind. So you've got this EM versus RTM. And so the RTM view, everyone who believes RTM thinks that there are symbols in the head. Everyone who believes eliminative materialism says there's no symbols. All it is mechanical operations at the brain level. So everything, so no symbols, all brain. Now, so that was what the essay one, the eliminative materialism is. However, if you accept there are symbols in the mind, there are still questions you can ask. And one of the questions you can ask is, when you're learning, and all learning is learning to, like, you learn that certain symbols go together or that they operate together. And one of the questions you can form at this point is, when you're learning, it's going to involve symbols. So if you're an eliminative materialist, let's just put this within the heading of how learning works. If you're a eliminative materialist, all learning is rewiring of a physical brain. Every materialist is going to hold that. Now, if, however, you accept RTM, there's still a question of how associative learning works. On one view, it's reasoning, and on the other view, it's, 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 on the other v strength of mental bonds or mental links. So insofar as they both involve links, the rewiring of a brain, so the way that the eliminative materialist is going to explain learning is physically the brain's wiring changes. Somebody who accepts this dual process view doesn't think learning is just to be explained in terms of brain rewiring. It thinks it's links, but it's links between mental symbols. So this is where the key difference is. For a dual process theorist, you do believe it's mental symbols. It's just that sometimes mental symbols can interact with each other in a way that bears some resemblance to the wiring in the brain. So the idea is there are like these metaphorical connections between beliefs that have a similar structure to the connections in the brain. But the key difference is they still want to say that we're talking about connections between symbols, not connections between physical meat parts. So you're correct that there are definite similarities, but it's important to remember that for somebody who accepts dual process theory, we're still talking in terms of psychological states and representation. So it's associations between or links between symbols, mental representations, not links between meat parts. So that's the way to think of that. Did that make sense? People here, we're good? All right. All right. So this is why we're talking about associative learning in this context. What I want to do quickly now is talk about just the basic ideas. We've just painted, like we've just gone through about the first paragraph and a half of the homework assignment reading. So we've got a lot more to talk about, but Ray asked, how does the propositional only theory explain the mistakes in logic? That is a great, great question, and one which I am not going to be addressing today and did not get addressed in the homework. Usually, though, as a matter of fact, what they allow for is that we can have conflicting beliefs. Actually, you know what? Let me address this question in some. If we go off track today, that's fine. Basically, the reason what the propositional only view will say is, one, the rules of logic that we follow in the brain can sometimes go wrong. So sometimes to reason, you need certain levels of energy and things which aren't there. And so what often happens is if we have these beliefs already, we will sometimes fall back upon those beliefs. So the way that a propositional only theorist will explain those mistakes in logic is that we have a belief, it's a matter of conflicting beliefs. So you have an image of someone in your head, and you have the belief that, so to go with what's more likely, someone is a cop or someone is a cop who votes for Trump. The way that this works is, instead of reasoning in this way where you say, all cops who vote for Trump are cops, therefore there are more cops than cops who vote for Trump. The way the reasoning works is instead you already have a belief that someone who looks like this, law and order, you have the belief that they vote for Trump. You don't necessarily just have the belief that they're a cop. So because you already have this belief, it's kind of skewing off your logical reasoning. And again, I'm not sure whether this is a good response, but this is generally how the propositional only view explains it. It says there are other beliefs in the background, and those beliefs can get in the way of your reasoning. So they're trying to say that we're not perfect reasoners. It's not mechanical. But there's this big question where, Ray, you're 100% right. If this is the major question to ask at this point is, if you go propositional only, you do lose your explanation for our logical problems. The way that this Mitchell-DeHauer reading goes is they say, all right, we might lose that explanation, but there are better independent reasons to go proposition only. And there are going to be further things we need to explain. But at the end of the day, those things we need to explain, that's okay because we're getting a better theory overall. All right. So the way to think of what I just want to do now is just compare the two theories, because basically the way the article works is the first part, they say these are the two theories. We've got the propositional only and we've got the dual process. And these are the ways they differ. These are the different predictions they make. These are the different views they have about how the mind works in these sorts of associative learning situations. Then what the article does is go through and say, now, if we look at the empirical evidence, if we actually look at what people find in labs, the better of the two, the one that makes more sense is the propositional only view. So what I want to do is put the two on the table and then go through, follow along with the article's reasoning for why the propositional only view is better. Now, I'm not sure, given what the time is, whether we're going to actually get into the arguments today. That might be in the supplemental video I record on Wednesday or Thursday, but let's just talk about the differences. So first off, we've already talked about what the mechanical difference is. The dual process theory says that associative learning between, let's just use the example of let's use the implicit bias example. They're going to say that what it is to the mechanism by which one comes to be implicitly biased is you have a mental representation of black, and that comes to be linked to a mental representation of bad. That's the mechanism. This mental representation to this one. If you, by contrast, hold the propositional only view, then the view is you have a belief, and the content of that belief is black people are bad, or even better, blackness causes a person to be bad. So that's like the content of the belief. So that's the mechanical difference between the two. So another key difference here to highlight is that in the dual process theory, there's no room to explain the nature of the connection between them. This is another way to talk about Kabir's question of what is the difference between them in terms of like, is this just a matter of eliminative materialism? Well, the answer is no, it is not, because both views allow this is a representation and this is a representation. The key difference lies here in the link. This is not representative for the pure connectivist association model. All it is there is a mechanical linking within the realm of the mind. So it's the black mechanically causes the badness to be activated. Or another way, if you think blackness, it will cause you to have the activation of badness. But this itself has no representational content. Well, over here, if it's the belief, if it's the propositional one, you first represent blackness and you represent badness, but you also do represent the relationship between them. So that's a major difference between the two. Another way of bringing out the difference is in terms of how strength of belief is accounted for, or strength of association. So as a matter of fact, we can have different strengths with which things are associated. So if a dog goes through 100 trials in which every single time the bell is rung, it's delivered food, the link between the bell and the food is going to be really, really strong. If it only happens once, there's not going to be a very strong link between the two. If you were to ring the bell, the dog might salivate a little bit more, but not a ton more. So the way that this is explained on the dual process mechanical view is strength is a matter of just like the size of the connection, the likelihood or the oomph with which blackness activates the concept of badness. So if somebody has a very, very strong implicit bias, it means you can think of it using like a mechanical metaphor of in the same way that the connection between a one computer and another computer is determined by how fast or big the cable is. In the same way, the connection between blackness and badness is determined by how physically, like, or I guess metaphorically big the connection between them is. So if you have a system like this where it's just black, tiny little connection to bad versus black, huge arrow. So that's how the phenomenon of different degrees of, or the different strengths of the association is explained. For propositional only view, you have to find some other explanation for it. So the way that the propositional only view can describe this is in two ways. One is that you actually say the content of the belief is a little bit different. So when somebody has a very strong implicit bias, it might be that they have the content blackness always causes badness. Well, if somebody has a weaker belief, it'll be that blackness can cause badness. So, and the other way is you can form confidence in your belief. So the idea would be that, all right, I have the belief that blackness causes a person to be bad, but I only have like a, I'm not super confident in that belief. Like maybe I'm wrong. Well, compare that with a belief in which, like, I believe the sun's going to rise tomorrow. That's a very, very strong belief. So I'm going to put these so they, so strength is a matter of size of connection. While over here, strength is a matter of confidence and content of belief. Does that make sense to people? This is just another way to bring out what the substantive differences between the two views are. All right. How blocking works. You know what? Let me think here. Yeah, let's talk about blocking. It's interesting. So here's a cool thing about association. I'm just going to put these lines here so I can use this with my workspace for the time being. What is blocking? Basically, if you give a dog the bell ring, so let's go with bell ring plus food. So if you give them the bell ring and every time the bell rings, you give them food, then over time, they're going to form the link between these two, however that forms. However, here's an interesting fact. If you then try to teach this creature to associate a light with the food, it's not going to work if you put the light and activate it at the same time the bell goes. So if you teach this creature to associate food with bell, and then every time the bell rings, you also flash a light, but then you take the bell away, the creature's never going to learn that the light also signifies the food. Why? Because its knowledge that the bell signifies food somehow blocks the new learning. Does that make sense? Does this sort of mechanism make sense of like how this blocking works? The idea is that if association is just a matter of showing two things together, then if every time you show a light, you get food. Every time you show a light, you get food. It should teach the thing to expect food after a light. But if you put the light next to a bell that it already knows signifies the food, then every time the bell rings, that will automatically be assumed to be the cause of the food coming or the signal, and therefore the light will never be learned to go with the food, even if every time going forward, the light is followed by food, the prior knowledge of the bell or the prior learning of the bell ringing leading to food will block the learning that the light will lead to food. Does this make some sense? Want some Yeah, okay, good. Thank you, Ray. All right, so how is it that blocking gets explained on the two views? Well, according to the dual process view, the way blocking works is it's, again, a mechanical process whereby the fact that there's already a link being activated blocks a new link from being formed. It's almost like as soon as the bell gets activated, automatically it goes straight to the food, and therefore there's not the strength to form another connection. While for the proposition only, it's going to be almost a sort of logical reasoning. It's going to be something along the lines of, so I'm just going to put this up like this. How blocking works: mechanical reasoning. So the way that the propositional only view would explain this is it's going to say, well, here's what's going on in the mind. At an unconscious level, the mind realizes, oh, there's a bell, and oh, there's a light. But I already know that the bell signals food. Therefore, there's nothing for the light to do. So I'm not going to form any beliefs about the light. So on the well, for dual process, the idea is that as soon as it sees the light, the link is already there and already activated. So there's no energy, no metaphorical energy in the thinking process to cause a new link to be formed. So is that difference sensible? We doing okay with that one? It's kind of, this stuff is somewhat difficult to talk about because there's so much, as Kabir brought up before, there's so many metaphors around discussing the mind. And what is it for there to be a link between a mental symbol and another mental symbol? We kind of have to think of it in a software sort of terminology. And I guess that's another way to think of the difference. In this sort of, in a dual process view, what associative learning is for one line of code by just to automatically, mechanically cause another line of code to appear. Well, in this case, you need a line of code in between that tells you to add the two together. If that didn't make sense, don't worry about it. All right. So the final differences between them are that on a dual process view, because it's supposed to be automatic, and this is what we talked about last time, it's supposed to be automatic and very low, like unconscious. One of the views is that you don't need attention for the learning to work. So long as you recognize that there is, as long as you become aware of the stimuli, you don't actually have to consciously be aware of the fact that they're linked together. It's just a mechanical process in your mind. It runs under the surface. So if you were to show the dog a light and then give them food, or the bell and the food, the dog wouldn't have to have the awareness, oh, bell signifies food. All it would need to do is be aware of a bell, and then the food will automatically happen. Well, for the propositional only view, because it's a higher, more intensive reasoning-based process, the idea is that in order for a creature to learn these sorts of associations, it needs attention it needs an awareness of the fact that there's a connection between the two. So a way of putting this is awareness of connection is needed. No awareness of connection. So another way to put this is putting yourself in the head of a dog. Like imagine a talking dog here in a Pavlov type experiment. If you give the dog the bell and food and train it in this way, it's gonna salivate. Now, according to the dual process theorist, if this dog could talk and you were to ask it, hey dog, do you know that there's that the bell signifies food? The dog could say, no, I had no awareness of it. I just automatically start salivating. Like I don't have any level of understanding. But according to a propositional only, if you were to ask this dog, it would have to be the case that the dog said, oh yes, I am aware of the fact that the bell signifies food. So in the one case, there's no awareness that there's a connection. While in the propositional only view, there is an awareness that there's a connection. Another one, the next difference concerns the amount of effort required to do the learning process in the first place. So remember we said with dual process, it's supposed to be really low effort. It's not supposed to make any difference how hungry you are, how tired you are, while something complicated like deciding parole is going to depend on how much food you've been given, how recently you've eaten, how well slept you are. So according to the dual process theory, associative learning should happen even if your mind is engaged elsewhere. So if you're doing another complex task, because it's such a low effort sort of thing, it's just a mechanical link forming process, you should be able to do it even if your mental effort is being expended elsewhere. It shouldn't matter how tired you are. It shouldn't matter anything. As long as you're aware of one signal and you're aware of, or one stimulus, and that it's linked to another stimulus, you should get the response. So no/low effort. While for the propositional only view, it's going to require a good amount of effort. So if you're off doing another task, you shouldn't you shouldn't be able to learn, because the learning involves reasoning, and reasoning takes mental effort. So the other difference here is that a propositional only view is going to say, hey, if we're trying to teach someone, if we're trying to teach a dog to learn associatively, then if we were to take all the dog's effort elsewhere, it'll never learn that the bell and the food go together. Well, the dual process view is going to say, oh, no. Even if the dog's mind is elsewhere, or with a child, even if the child is off doing something else, this low-level dual process sort of mechanical learning will still happen. The next two are, will it be sensitive to logic? And what do I mean by this? Well, according to a dual process view, there's no room for reasoning or logic in this sort of associative learning. So if you learn that two things go together, because it's just a matter of strength, you shouldn't be able to apply logical rules to these conclusions. If black and bad is in this sort of mechanical relation, you couldn't then put a symbol like not attached to it. It's a purely mechanical approach, so you can't reason. If you see two things that operate a certain way, you can't then draw a further conclusion about some similar thing, because this isn't open to that sort of logical reasoning. Well, for a propositional only view, it should be sensitive to logical process and logical reasoning. So if a bell is rung and you're associated with food, then you might be able to draw conclusions that would stop you from reaching that conclusion in the future. That made no sense. Give me 1 second. I need a sip of water. So to go with the idea of, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying with the implicit bias. If you believe that implicit bias is a matter of dual processing, so if you think it's associative learning and associative learning is a matter of the dual process approach, then you can't reason with that association. It's a purely mechanical sort of process. It's not the thing that you could say, hey, that applies here, therefore it should also apply here, or but not all people of this are that. It's too low level. Well, if you think it's a belief, you should be able to give arguments and reasons to explain it. So that's the final, or the second to final one. So dual process, no logical sensitivity. While for the propositional only, it is logically sensitive, or is open to argument, is open to reasoning, behaves in ways that these associations can be part of our reasoning going forward. We can use the fact that blackness causes a person to be bad we could then draw a conclusion from that, like therefore some race causes people to be bad. Well, over here, that's not going to be available. It's a totally low level thing. Any questions at this point? Are we doing okay? All right. The last one is sensitivity to language. A dual process, these sorts of low-level things, language is a rather high-level sort of thinking. It's complicated. We can understand sentences, but in terms of like using language to change or interact with our beliefs, that's a pretty high-level propositional type of thinking, because sentences, as we've said, express propositions. The cat is wearing a hat is true or false. It's the sort of thing that can be true or false. Therefore, if a sort of associative learning is sensitive to language, or if you can learn associative interactions by means of language, that would be a sign for the propositional only view, that associative learning really is a matter of having beliefs on an unconscious level, as opposed to just having different concepts connected in a web of concepts. So yes, sensitive to language. No, not sensitive. All right, I'm going to pause here for 1 second. Does this make sense to people? Does this overall, are we okay? We're doing all right here. Given that my mind is elsewhere and a lot of us aren't here and everything else, I'm having trouble judging how clearly I'm explaining this stuff. So any questions at this point? All right. Well, in that case, I'm just going to briefly say, we've now got these two views on the table. And so given that this is what a dual process theorist is committed to, and this is what the propositional only theorist is committed to, the question now at this point is, how would you decide between the two? And what basically the rest of the article is it's trying to argue that when you look at the actual data, if you look at the evidence of how humans actually behave, the behavior is much better explained with the propositional only view. So basically the way that they do this, the way they tell the difference in the article, is they go through and explain like, hey, the first part is they say, hey, there's evidence that we do need attention. We do need attention to learn these connections and respond to them in the future. So that's a point in favor of the propositional only view. It also seems like it takes effort. Another point in favor. Also, it seems like it is sensitive to logical reasoning. Associative learning can be sensitive to logical rules. Another point in favor of propositional. Then it says, yes, it's also sensitive to language. Another point in favor of propositional. And then this next part of the article is they say, all right, then let's look at the evidence that people say, actually, dual process is the way to go. And they try to respond to those. And so that's what I'm going to do in the supplemental video, is just go through the arguments that the authors give for why, given that this is what the dual process view of associative learning is committed to, and this is what the propositional only view is committed to, why this is the way to go. So that's all I wanted to say today. Rather than stopping halfway through, I mean, I could go start giving the reasons, but it makes more sense to just stop here, and I'll include it in the video afterwards, since most people in the class are going to be watching the videos anyway. I wish you all the best of luck staying sane today. Yes, it's also going to be one topic for the next paper, Ray. Best of luck staying sane today, whatever your political views or lack of them. Have a good one, and I will see you all next week. But remember,